I have one citizen's comment card from Miss Kathy Howard. Miss Howard? Miss Howard must have stepped away. Okay. All right, we'll move on with our agenda then. That brings us to our city manager reports. Ms. Gillen?
Thank you and good evening. One of our goals from the council retreat we held in January earlier this year is to improve our housing stock. We discussed a number of tools that we could utilize to this end. Mr. Atkins is here to further discuss two of the tools and to review timeframes with City Council. Mr. Atkins.
Good evening, Mr. Atkins.
Good evening. We're working out technical difficulties. I apologize. Okay, thank you. At the retreat, and frankly, over the last year, actually the last 2 years, we've talked about other things we can do to deal with vacant properties and abandoned properties and bank-owned properties, and the areas that we've had trouble reaching for code enforcement. We've got pretty good programs in place for homeowners that just won't comply. We can take you to court, we can do things and try to gain your compliance. If you are low income, we have programs and you're an owner, I can help you with programs. We've got the Baraka projects, we've got the group work camps. There are a whole set of tools and systems that we have in place to reach a large portion of our community, but there's been a portion of the last 2 or 3 years of primarily vacant properties and bank-owned properties that are in various stages of foreclosure that we've had trouble reaching. The other group that we've had trouble reaching are out-of-town landlords that won't come into the jurisdiction to get served court works and things like that. So there's a few things that we want to talk about tonight. The first one, Mr. Landon and I have been working on Chapter 1436, the Property Maintenance Code, and at the next meeting we'll be bringing some changes to that for your consideration. What the main change that I am interested in right at the moment, among others, is spelling out in greater detail when we can enter a property, especially a vacant property, to perform abatement that's not an immediate health and safety threat. Obviously, if there's a tree that's about to fall into the right-of-way and hurt somebody, we already have the ability to act in those situations. We're going to try to expand that so that if we're on a vacant property and there are problems that are starting to blight the house, starting to ruin the house, we're not going to rehab the house, we're not going to renovate the house, but we would like to stop the deterioration, and especially if it's a minor safety hazard, have the legal ability to go on and just correct that one item, step back out of the property. So we're going to put that up for your consideration at the next meeting. The other thing we talked about at the council retreat was what other communities are doing with rental registration and vacant property ordinances.
You mean inside the property?
No, this is just all exterior.
Oh, okay.
This would be exterior property maintenance. As we stated before, City Council has previously asked what more could be done to assist in turning around our housing stock, given the wide number of foreclosures, vacant properties, and the poor quality of some of our rentals. We talked a little bit about what other communities have accomplished using the vacant property and the rental registration ordinances. Earlier this year, we've talked about land banking. These are two more tools that fit closely into the land bank concept. Some of these, at some point, if they don't comply and we end up leaning property in vacant property and they don't comply, you would have the ability to foreclose on your lien and eventually seize that property away from somebody that will not take care of their property, especially if they're an out-of-town and won't come in to get served. So in theory, at the end, and I'll show you this, you would get to a place where if nothing else happens and they absolutely will not take care of their property, they will not do anything, this gives us eventually a tool to eventually seize the property after a long due process and take the property and put it into a land bank in theory. Two of the other things we talked about at the retreat were what other people have done, other cities have done with vacant land ordinances and rental registration ordinances. Again, the purpose of these would be to hold owners accountable for property maintenance of vacant and abandoned properties and to protect the values of our housing stock. I wanted to talk a little about each one. There are several all over the state of both of these types of ordinances. The general characteristics are that for rental registration, the landlord must register the property prior to occupation by the lessee. There's a fee for registration used to pay for inspections. Most have a cap of some kind so that if you are a apartment complex, you're not paying 300 registration fees. There's a cap. Property must be inspected by the city. Most require exterior inspections only. A few do interior as well. Property must comply with local property maintenance, nuisance, and building codes to pass the inspection. Property cannot be occupied with a past inspection and certificate of occupancy, and most of them require annual registration. These are a list of the cities in Ohio right now that are using rental registration, including Centerville and Oxford. Vacant property registration. Again, the same type of concept for vacant property. Must register the property annually. There's a penalty for failure to register. One of the nice things about this is most communities are putting a very, very broad definition of owner to basically include anybody that has any interest whatsoever in that property. And the idea is to find somebody to hold accountable for this bank-owned property. If it is not registered, most communities have a process where the late fee is just assessed as a lien, both the registration fee and a penalty for failure to register. There's some definition of vacant property that specifies when a property is vacant so that people understand when they are required to register and how. There's a fee for registration. Some have a standard fee for residential or commercial. Others have an escalating fee based on how long it's vacant. I've seen ones that just $25 a year. The worst one I think Mr. Landon and I saw, and I don't remember, I believe it was Minneapolis, Minnesota, that if it sits for about 5 years, there's a $10,000 fee a year for leaving a vacant property in Minneapolis. That's not what we're proposing to you, but just to give you some bookends. The property must comply with all local property maintenance, nuisance, and building codes while it sits vacant. As you can see, many more cities in Ohio are using some form of vacant property registration at this time, and most of these have been enacted in the last 3 or 4 years as an answer to the foreclosure crisis. The process for something like this, first get input from the area municipalities that are doing these types of things. I have already pulled their ordinances. I've also had some discussions with various cities about what has worked, what hasn't worked. And it really, a lot of it depended on what they were trying to accomplish. The ones that just wanted to capture the information and had a $25 fee, they had different ideas as opposed to people who were really trying to get out and inspect and register and get on these people who are not taking care of their properties. So we have compiled the different ordinances from throughout the state. Similar to what we did with the swap shop, our suggestion is to form a committee with each type of ordinance to include city staff, potentially, law department, finance department, community revitalization, Middletown police, and also then for the rental registration to get 2 or 3 reputable landowners, landlords, and probably at least one apartment complex. And as we did with the swap shop, sit down and say, this is what we're trying to do. Here's what people across the state are doing. I was involved a little bit with the swap shops, but it seemed to be a very good process where we want to have a process that gives us everything we need and be as minimally as intrusive as we can in the business owners of the city. And so we would like to get the banks and some of the local banks and stuff involved, a couple vacant property landowners, a couple single-family renters, a couple apartment complexes, and build a committee and then start going through these ordinances to see if we can come up with a consensus as to what might work for the city of Middletown. Tried to lay out a timeline for you as to how this might work. My guess is it would take a month or 2 to gather that committee together and then go ahead and have those discussions, assuming we could come up with something that was appeared to be something in the best interest of Middletown. We would then bring that forward in somewhere around July, either via, again, city manager reports as we're doing tonight, or perhaps a city council work session go over the results of those committee findings, show you perhaps a draft ordinance of what we think might work in Middletown, get your comments. If appropriate, then we would bring it back in August for possible passage by council. These are going to require a lot of manpower and work to do. So we will need 2 or 3 months of time.
Can
Yes,
I
sir.
interrupt you for just 1 minute? I got an update here. The Trenton Police Department spotted a funnel cloud that had not touched down, but we're in a safe zone here in council chambers. But again, those watching TV should probably take cover and pay attention to the news and weather. So, okay. Mr. Atkins, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. It would take us 2 or 3 months to ramp this up. We would have to hire enough inspectors. What I would not want to do is enact something like this and then immediately leave landlords and owners sitting there unable to do what they need to do because we weren't ready. So we would need to ramp up with inspectors and cars and computers and software to be ready to do this. In theory, we'd mail out registration notices in November and execute this with active implementation on January 1st, 2013. In theory, this is how it all comes together. You have a non-compliant property. If it's a demolition candidate, we push it towards demolition. If it's vacant property, we get it registered and hold somebody accountable. If it's a rental property, we make sure it's up to code. Property taxes are paid, water bills paid, income taxes filed, etc. And if it's an owner-owned property, we would then follow through, either taking them to court or giving them assistance as the situation warranted. What I'm looking for tonight from council is just a nod to go forward with the next step in this, which would be, we have already gathered the various ordinances. We've seen what works and wasn't. We've had some discussions with the city. The next step for us would be to form those committees and spend the next 30 to 60 days going over these things so that we could bring it back to council after that.
Yeah. Any initial thoughts or comments from council in terms of Mr. Atkins' presentation or suggestions? Mr. Muller?
Well, I would support taking action on this and putting staff time into it and getting the feedback from the owners too, because I think it's important that you have the tools that you need to cure this issue in our community.
There's no magic bullet for all this. It's every one of these is a different piece of the puzzle. And I will say that these have been successful in other communities. But again, each of these might solve another 10 or 15% of the problem. And we just continue to work towards getting all of our properties back in compliance and getting everything demolished that should be.
Does this fit in with the land bank idea too?
Especially the vacant property ordinance does, because if you get a vacant property that will not register, you have somebody that's out of town, that's vacant, that isn't taking care of it, won't register it, won't give you anybody. Eventually, under most of these vacant property ordinances, you could slap not only the registration fee, but some kind of a penalty as a lien on the property. And what you would do then is let that lien become delinquent and foreclose on your lien, and you would attempt to seize that property away from the landowner that's not taking care of it. And at that point, if the land bank is up and running, you would take that, deposit it in the land bank, and start the process to put it back into productive use again.
This would, if we are doing this across the board, the landowners that are complying with regulations only see us once a year, and they do help pay for the...
They do, and the way most communities do the vacant properties is if you are a vacant landowner and you're keeping your property up, the fee is very minimal. The penalties and the if you don't register or if you have a history of non-compliance with the property maintenance code, then the fees go up. Again, that's why we would want to meet with those, for the banks that are taking care of their properties. We want to know who's in charge. We want to know who to call if there's a problem. But that's as much as we need to do. And so, it would be the people who won't talk to us, won't come into town, won't take care of their property, and basically sit off at some far location out of our reach and say, not my problem.
How would the committee members be selected, specifically the landlords?
we'd have to sit down and talk about that. I can tell you that we have to have, in my opinion, at least a couple reputable landlords that do single-family homes and at least one apartment complex, because those are the two major types of landlords that we have. We need enough representation that we get a broad, viewpoint of what works and what doesn't.
Where do you envision the funds coming from to get started?
At the retreat, I gave you a small, and it was a shotgun, but the answer is you would have to appropriate funds on the front end out of probably the nuisance abatement fund to get started, and then take some of the fees and put them back in the nuisance abatement fund, and then it should be self-generating from that point on.
It also strikes me that you're going to have a very difficult time getting service on people. How are you going to, these are out-of-town property owners who aren't responding to anything you're doing now, and on top of that, you're going to try to do all of these other things.
And the difference is the vacant property ordinance says if you fail to register after being served by the International Property Maintenance Code, we register you for you. In other words, I don't know where you are and I can't get you, but the fee kicks in, and most communities are talking about like a $1,000 fee and a $1,000 penalty for failure to register, and leaning that against the property. And again, when that becomes delinquent, landlord can, or the homeowner, or the vacant property owner can pay it, come into town and take care of it, or we'll go ahead and foreclose on our lien and seize the property.
Don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of where you're going, but I'm concerned about an out-of-town property owner that you can't serve, that you can't locate, and we're going to we're thinking about implementing these new ordinances. I think you're an attorney, you know all these things, but you have grandfather issues, you have all kinds of due process issues. This is not going to be easy.
It's not going to be easy. It has been done successfully in other communities. It has been upheld, and there's always publication.
Okay.
Other questions for Mr. Atkins? Any indications of, concern or moving forward?
Is council comfortable, moving forward to at least form the committees and discuss it to the point where we could at least bring it back and show you what we got?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think don't hear any opposition to not
Thank you
moving
very
forward.
much.
So thank you. Appreciate the update. Appreciate the work. Okay. Anything else, Ms. Gillen?
Yes, a couple more items.
Okay.
Charlie Anderson has been selected by his peers as the April Employee of the Month. He's been with Middletown since March of 1997. In his supervisory role as a public works leader in water maintenance, Charlie is responsible for directing the day-to-day operations of work crews in the installation, maintenance, and repair of various city facilities. Charlie takes time to make sure the citizens of Middletown are satisfied with services provided.